Imagine being only 7 years old, and already your future is decided. Not school, not games, but a destiny to fight, to bleed, and perhaps to die for honor. This was the beginning of a knight's journey. For most boys born into the nobility, childhood was brief and filled with discipline. At the age of 7, they were sent away from their family's home to live in the household of another noble lord. Why? Because training to become a knight required complete immersion. At this age, the boy became a page. Pages learned the basics: how to serve at the table, how to behave with courtesy, and how to ride a horse. They practiced running, wrestling, and even basic literacy if the family could afford it. But their true education was not books. It was discipline, obedience, and loyalty. Here's a fascinating fact. Pages were expected to memorize songs, poems, and stories of legendary knights. They weren't just trained for combat. They were trained to embody an ideal. Knights were seen as warriors, but also as symbols of chivalry and faith. By the age of 14, a boy became a squire. This was the most intense stage of preparation. As a squire, he was attached to a knight, serving him in daily life. He cared for the knight's armor, polished the sword, and helped him mount the horse. But it wasn't just chores. This was hands-on training for the battlefield. A squire learned to fight with lance, sword, and shield. He practiced jousting, a skill that was not just sport but preparation for real combat. He rode war horses, trained with blunt weapons, and joined hunting expeditions. Hunting, in fact, was considered vital training because it built endurance, precision, and courage. Here's another fact. Squires also went to war. They did not fight in the front lines, but they followed their knights into battle. Their duty was to carry weapons, rescue wounded men, and even drag their master's body from the battlefield if he fell. It was dangerous, but it was the only way to learn. The squire stage lasted about 7 years. If he survived and proved his loyalty and skill, he was ready for the moment every boy dreamed of: knighthood. The ceremony was both sacred and dramatic. First, the squire bathed, symbolizing purification. Then he spent the night in a chapel, praying beside his armor and sword. In the morning, he dressed in white robes for purity, a red cloak for readiness to shed blood, and black stockings for the reminder of death. Finally, the lord or king touched the squire on the shoulders with a sword, the famous dubbing, and he rose as a knight. Sometimes the ritual included a symbolic blow to the face or neck, called the kali. Why? To remind the new knight that he must endure pain and humiliation without fear. But knighthood was not only about ceremony. Becoming a knight was expensive. Armor, weapons, and horses cost a fortune. Many squires never achieved the title because their families couldn't afford it. In fact, knights were as much a social class as a military one. They were the armed elite of medieval society. So the path to knighthood was never easy. It began in childhood, was forged in discipline, and was sealed with blood, faith, and fortune. This was only the beginning of the knight's life. But once the sword touched his shoulder, the real test began: to live by the code of honor, and to survive the brutal world of medieval warfare. What does it mean to be a knight? Is it about shining armor, gallant manners, and defending the weak? Or is it about survival, blood, and power? The truth lies somewhere between the legend and the battlefield. After being dubbed, a knight entered a life of constant training. His body was his weapon. Heavy armor could weigh 25 to 30 kilograms, and wearing it required strength, balance, and endurance. A knight trained with swords, axes, and lances almost every day. He practiced mounting and riding war horses, often while wearing full armor, to make sure he could fight without collapsing under the weight. But it wasn't just about muscles. Knights were trained in strategy. They learned how to form cavalry charges, how to break enemy lines, and how to defend castles under siege. A well-trained knight was not only a fighter, but also a commander, expected to lead men in chaos. One of the most striking facts is that knights practiced combat in tournaments. These were not the romantic just you see in movies. Early tournaments were violent melees, where dozens of knights fought across open fields, sometimes for hours. Broken bones were common, and death was not unusual. Only later did jousting become a more controlled sport, but even then it was deadly. So where does the famous code of chivalry come in? Chivalry is one of the greatest myths of the Middle Ages. Yes, knights swore to uphold honor, loyalty, and to protect the weak. Yes, they pledged service to God and to their Lord. But reality was far more brutal. Many knights plundered villages, murdered peasants, and even broke their oaths when money was involved. Chroniclers often complained about knights without mercy, men who used their swords for profit, not justice. Still, the idea of chivalry was powerful. The church promoted it to control violence. Knights were told they fought not just for their lord, but for God. They took part in rituals like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, movements that tried to ban fighting on holy days or against unarmed peasants. Did knights always obey? Not at all. But the idea shaped how knights were remembered. Here's a fascinating detail. The Song of Roland, one of the oldest French epics, describes knights as fearless warriors loyal to the death. This wasn't a history book. It was propaganda. Stories like this taught knights how they should behave, even if reality was messy. Training also included culture. A knight was expected to be more than a brute. He learned music, poetry, and dancing. Why? Because knights were also performers at court. They needed to charm ladies, impress lords, and show refinement. Courtly love became part of chivalric identity, where knights pledged service to noblewomen as symbols of purity and inspiration. But again, this had its contradictions. While poetry spoke of knights as protectors of women, real history tells us of battles, raids, and violence against civilians, including women. The code was often more of an ideal than a reality. And yet, the legend mattered. Knights who lived without honor were remembered as bandits. Knights who embraced the code, even imperfectly, were celebrated in chronicles, songs, and later in literature. So what does it mean to live by the code of honor? It means living in the space between myth and blood, between the shining ideal and the muddy battlefield. The knight's life was one of endless contradictions, privilege and poverty, splendor and brutality. The code of chivalry gave knights a moral compass, even if they often ignored it. But once honor was lost, it was almost impossible to win back. And beyond the ideals of chivalry lay something every knight desired: privilege. Lands, titles, and wealth, rewards for loyalty and service. But those privileges came with their own price, and often with hidden dangers. For a young man of noble birth, knighthood was more than a duty. It was a ticket to privilege, to status, and to power. Becoming a knight was expensive, but if achieved, it offered rewards that ordinary peasants could never dream of. Unlike farmers tied to the soil, knights stood among the military elite. They were respected, feared, and often envied. One of the greatest privileges was land. A loyal knight could be granted estates by his lord. These estates brought wealth through crops, rents from peasants, and rights over villages. Imagine the leap. From serving as a squire polishing armor to owning fields, mills, and serfs who worked for you. Here's a fact. In feudal society, land was power. A knight who received land became not only a warrior but also a landlord. He could collect taxes, administer justice on his estate, and build influence that passed down to his heirs. In some cases, knights rose to become barons or even higher lords. But land was not the only reward. Knights often received tangible gifts for service. Fine horses, gold, jewelry, or even luxurious clothing. Chronicles tell us of tournaments where winners could claim ransoms, seizing the armor and horses of defeated opponents. A single victory could be worth a fortune, because a war horse and full suit of armor could cost as much as a small village. There were also political privileges. Knights were closer to kings and princes than common men. They dined in castles, joined councils, and sometimes advised rulers. Their loyalty could earn them titles, marriages into wealthy families, and places at royal courts. Yet privilege was not always secure. Here's another fact. A knight's fortune could rise and fall with war. Victory brought honor and reward. Defeat could mean losing everything: land, freedom, even life. Captured knights were often held for ransom, and while wealthy families could pay, many lesser knights were ruined forever. Still, the knights' privileges extended beyond wealth. They also had a social aura. Knights were admired figures, celebrated in songs and stories. To wear the armor, to ride into tournaments, to serve in crusades. These gave knights a glory that peasants and townsfolk could only watch from afar. Marriage was another area of privilege. A knight with land and wealth could secure a powerful marriage alliance, sometimes with noblewomen far above his original station. These unions strengthened families, built alliances, and secured generations of influence. Here's a fascinating detail. Knights also had the right to bear their own coat of arms. These symbols of identity were painted on shields, banners, and castles. A coat of arms was not just decoration. It was recognition, a sign of belonging to the noble class. Without one, you were not truly considered part of the knightly order. But privileges carried weight. Knights were expected to maintain their honor. To fail in courage, to abandon a lord, or to disgrace their family meant losing more than wealth. It meant losing status. A knight without honor was worse than a peasant, because he had betrayed the very foundation of his class. So knighthood was not only a burden of training and duty, it was also a ladder to wealth, land, and power. But every step up that ladder came with risks, because privilege was fragile, and the battlefield was always waiting. The songs tell us of glory. The paintings show shining armor. But the battlefield told a different story, one of mud, blood, and unbearable weight. Knights are often imagined as noble heroes charging into battle with banners flying. But real medieval warfare was brutal, exhausting, and often miserable. First, there was the armor. A full suit of plate armor in the 15th century could weigh up to 30 kilograms. Contrary to modern myths, knights could move fairly well in it, even run and mount horses. But imagine wearing it for hours under the summer sun, without clean water, with sweat soaking every layer of padding beneath the steel. Heat stroke and exhaustion were common, even before a single sword was swung. Then came the weapons of war. The knight's lance was powerful but fragile. Once broken in the first charge, he switched to swords, axes, or maces. Against heavily armored foes, maces and warhammers were more effective than blades, designed to crush bone beneath steel. The battlefield itself was chaos. Unlike the staged justs of tournaments, real combat was loud, confusing, and terrifying. Horses screamed, men shouted, horns blared, and weapons clashed. A knight had to fight not only his enemies but also the crush of his own allies, pressed together in a violent storm of bodies. Here's a fact. One of the deadliest threats to knights was not the sword, but the longbow. At battles like Agincourt in 1415, English archers devastated French knights with storms of arrows. A single longbow could pierce armor at close range, and thousands firing together could break a cavalry charge before it even reached the enemy. Knights also faced the horrors of sieges. Defending or attacking castles was slow and brutal. Imagine weeks living in mud outside enemy walls, eating rotten food, drinking polluted water. Disease often killed more soldiers than fighting. Inside castles, defenders poured boiling water, oil, or even quicklime on attackers. Starvation was a weapon too. Many sieges ended when knights surrendered not to swords, but to hunger. Here's another harsh detail. Knights who fell in battle faced a terrifying risk. While nobles were often ransomed if captured, a knight who collapsed in heavy armor could be suffocated in mud or trampled to death by friend and foe alike. And then there were the wounds. Medieval medicine was crude. A deep cut could lead to infection. Arrows lodged in flesh were burned out with hot iron. Amputations were common. Even if a knight survived battle, he often carried scars, pain, or permanent disability. The reality of war stripped away the ideals of chivalry. Knights might swear to protect the weak, but on campaign, villages were looted, peasants killed, and women assaulted. Chroniclers recorded how armies left scorched earth in their path. For common people, knights were not always protectors, they were often the nightmare. Yet, despite the brutality, knights were bound to battle by duty and by their oaths. Warfare was the test of their honor. the stage on which they could rise in fame or fall in disgrace. Here's a chilling fact. Even victorious knights rarely experienced the kind of glory we imagine today. After Agincourt, French knights described the battlefield as a sea of mud, filled with corpses and broken steel. Victory still smelled of blood and rot. So the reality of battle was not romance. It was sweat, terror, and mud. It was fighting not only the enemy, but hunger, disease, and exhaustion. It was surviving a nightmare only to face the next campaign. And yet, danger did not end on the battlefield. Even away from war, knights faced constant risks. Rivalries, political betrayal, financial ruin, and sudden death. Privilege brought power but also painted a target on their backs. Knighthood promised honor and privilege, but it also came with shadows. For every knight who rose in glory, another fell to betrayal, disease, or a nameless grave. The most obvious danger was battle itself. We imagine knights dying in heroic duels, but in reality, many perished in mud, pierced by arrows, or crushed in the chaos of cavalry charges. Even surviving a fight did not guarantee safety. Wounds often led to infection. Without antibiotics, a small cut could kill as surely as a sword. Here's a fact. In medieval Europe, life expectancy for nobles was higher than for peasants, unless they were knights. Warfare and constant campaigns shortened their lives dramatically. But the dangers extended far beyond the battlefield. Disease was a constant threat. Campaigns meant long marches, bad food, polluted water, and filthy camps. Dysentery, fever, and plague spread easily among soldiers. Chronicles describe armies losing half their men to sickness before they ever reached the enemy. Knights also faced the risk of capture. Unlike common soldiers, they were valuable prisoners. If captured alive, a knight could be ransomed for huge sums of money. Some became rich from ransoms, others bankrupt from paying them. Families sold land, borrowed from moneylenders, or begged their lords to rescue their sons. For some, a single defeat meant financial ruin for generations. And then came the political dangers. Knights served lords and kings, but loyalty was a double-edged sword. Choosing the wrong side in a civil war could mean execution or disgrace. History is full of knights who were celebrated as heroes one year, then branded as traitors the next. Here's another chilling fact. Knights were not immune to betrayal from within. Some were murdered by rivals hungry for their land or titles. Others were abandoned by kings who no longer found them useful. To be a knight was to live in a dangerous game of politics, where one misstep could mean ruin. Even in times of peace, knights lived under pressure. Maintaining armor, horses, and weapons was costly. Those who lacked wealth often turned to mercenary work, selling their swords to whoever paid. These men were feared but also despised, called free companies. They roamed Europe, plundering villages when not hired for war. Many knights who fell into poverty ended their lives as little more than armed bandits. Here's a detail often forgotten. Knights also faced religious dangers. A knight excommunicated by the church lost not only spiritual salvation, but also social standing. Without the church's blessing, his oaths and honors meant nothing. Some knights who defied church orders, especially during the Crusades, were branded as sinners instead of heroes. Death came in many forms. A lance on the battlefield, a fever in camp, starvation during a siege, or the cold blade of an assassin in a dark corridor. Very few knights lived to old age. And yet, despite all these risks, the idea of knighthood endured. Why? Because it promised something beyond wealth. It offered a chance at immortality in memory. To die in battle could mean being remembered in songs and chronicles. To fight for king or god gave meaning to the sacrifice. So danger was never separate from privilege. It was the other side of the same sword. Knighthood gave status, but it also painted a target. And every knight lived knowing that death could strike at any moment. But if danger haunted their lives, it was legend that outlived them. Stories of knights, both noble and cruel, shaped how we remember the Middle Ages. And while reality was full of mud and blood, their legacy became poetry, myth, an inspiration for centuries. The clashing of swords has long faded. The castles are ruins. But the image of the knight remains, brighter in legend than it ever was in life. Knights lived in a world of contradictions. Privilege and danger, faith and violence, honor and betrayal. But their greatest legacy was not in the mud of battlefields, nor in the estates they once ruled. Their legacy was in memory, in the myths and symbols that still shape our imagination today. The first part of that legacy is chivalry. The code of honor, though often broken, became a cultural ideal. Literature from the Middle Ages, like the Song of Roland in France or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in England, painted knights as paragons of loyalty, bravery, and purity. These stories were not descriptions of reality. They were moral blueprints teaching society what a knight should be. And though knights often failed to live up to it, the legend was stronger than the truth. Here's a fact. By the Renaissance, the military role of knights was fading. Gunpowder and cannons made heavy cavalry less dominant. Yet at the same time, writers and poets celebrated knights more than ever. Chivalry became an ideal long after its practical purpose was gone. Another part of the legacy is romance. Courtly love, with its poems and songs of devotion to unattainable ladies, became part of Europe's cultural DNA. Even today, when we think of medieval times, we imagine knights kneeling before noblewomen, pledging service. This romantic image has little to do with the brutality of medieval war, but it has lasted centuries. Knights also left a legacy in symbols. Coats of arms, tournaments, and the very image of shining armor became emblems of nobility. Even modern military traditions, such as medals, salutes, and oaths of loyalty, trace roots to the rituals of knighthood. Here's another fascinating detail. In the 19th century, during the Victorian era, there was a revival of knightly ideals. Writers like Sir Walter Scott turned medieval knights into heroes of popular novels, fueling a wave of medieval fascination that influenced everything from architecture to politics. The myth of the noble knight was reborn for a new age. But perhaps the strongest legacy is in modern storytelling. From fairy tales to Hollywood films, knights became larger than life. They are heroes in shining armor, rescuers of damsels, defenders of kingdoms. Rarely do these stories mention dysentery in the camps, the stench of battle, or the weight of unpaid debts. Instead, the legend has replaced the man. And yet, myths are powerful. The knight's legacy teaches us about human longing. We want to believe in honor, in loyalty, in bravery, even if history shows us contradictions. The knight is a symbol not of what the Middle Ages were, but of what we wish they had been. Here's one more fact. Knighthood itself has not fully died. Titles of knighthood still exist today in some countries, like the Order of the British Empire. Though no one rides into battle in plate armor anymore, the word knight still carries a weight of honor, respect, and tradition. So the knight's legacy is not iron or blood. It is memory. It is the dream of a better warrior, one who fought not for greed but for honor. And though history tells us otherwise, we still choose to believe in the legend. The life of a knight was hard, dangerous, and often short. But the myth of the knight, the shining armor, the noble code, the loyal heart has outlived empires. And in every story, every film, every dream of medieval glory, the knight rides again.